She wasn't a porcelain doll, and she was never meant to be a prisoner. With her soft curves, heavy thighs, and plush waist, Penelope was a Renaissance painting brought to life in a world of starving, angular monsters. The ancient vampire king worshipped her body, dripping her in diamonds and locking her away from the sun. But when his love turned into a suffocating, bloody cage, she did the impossible. She ran, and for his missing queen, the king would gladly burn the world to ashes. The frozen earth of the Whitmore estate bit through the thin soles of Penelope's velvet slippers, but she dared not stop. Her breath tore through her lungs in ragged white plumes. Her thick thighs chafed against each other under the heavy silk of her nightgown, and her plush, soft body, a body that had been worshipped, pampered, and kissed 1,000 times by the most dangerous creature on the eastern seaboard, was pushed to its absolute physical limit. She was a woman of generous proportions, built for comfort and warmth, not for sprinting through the dense, unforgiving woods of upstate New York in the dead of winter. Yet the sheer primal terror pumping through her veins gave her a desperate, unnatural stamina. Behind her, hidden in the craggy cliffs overlooking the Hudson River, loomed the colossal stone fortress known to the modern world as the historical Whitmore Manor. To Penelope, it was merely the golden cage where Lucius Carlyle reigned. Lucius, the name alone sent a violent shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the January frost. He was a creature of ancient aristocratic nightmares, a vampire lord whose wealth stretched through centuries and whose influence dictated the rise and fall of modern politicians. When Penelope had first arrived at the estate 6 months ago as an archivist for the Kensington Antiquities Trust, she had been thoroughly intimidated. She was a heavy-set, quiet historian in her late 20s, accustomed to being overlooked in favor of thinner, more conventionally glamorous women. But Lucius had not overlooked her. From the moment she stepped into his vaulted library, clutching her research notes against her full chest, his cold, predatory eyes had locked onto her with a terrifying, consuming hunger. He hadn't just desired her, he had revered her. In a nocturnal high society filled with gaunt, statuesque immortals and their razor-thin human companions, Penelope's lush, full-figured body was a revelation to him. He treated her like a goddess plucked from an oil painting. He had bespoke corsets crafted from Parisian silk that didn't pinch or bind, but gently supported her heavy breasts and hugged her thick waist. He fed her decadent, rich meals prepared by a private Michelin-starred chef, watching with dark, obsessive pleasure as she ate, kissing the soft curve of her jaw and whispering that she was the only real warm thing in his endless, freezing existence. At first it had felt like a dark, intoxicating fairy tale, but the velvet ropes of his affection quickly tightened into steel chains. Her phone was subtly replaced with one that only allowed calls to the estate's internal network. Her emails to the trust were intercepted and replied to by his sprawling corporate entity, Aegis Financial. And then came the sudden tragic disappearances. First, it was her intrusive landlord in Boston, who was reportedly lost in a boating accident. Then it was Joanne, her closest friend, who abruptly moved to London and ceased all communication. Penelope had blinded herself to the truth until tonight. Unable to sleep, she had wandered into the forbidden west wing of the manor. In Lucius's private, soundproofed study, she found a locked mahogany drawer left carelessly ajar. Inside wasn't a collection of antique coins or corporate documents, but a horrifying trophy case. There was her landlord's tarnished watch, and sitting right beside it, coated in a terrifyingly thick layer of dried brown blood, was the silver locket Joanne had worn every day since college. He hadn't just isolated her, he had systematically slaughtered anyone who anchored her to the human world. He was pruning her life, cutting away every branch until she had no choice but to rely solely on him. And tomorrow night, on the eve of his coven's winter solstice gala, she knew he intended to turn her to freeze her soft, warm body in an eternity of blood and darkness. A branch snapped back, whipping across Penelope's face and stinging her cheek, pulling her back to the freezing reality of the woods. She stumbled over an exposed root, her heavy frame hitting the frozen mud with a dull thud. Pain exploded in her knee, but she bit down on her lip so hard she tasted copper, refusing to scream. She scrambled back up, her hands scraped and bleeding. She had bribed a newly turned guard, a young man named Thomas, with a priceless Byzantine ruby she had stolen from Lucius's vault. Thomas had disabled the perimeter wards for exactly 4 minutes. If she didn't reach Route 9 by the time the wards reactivated, the psychic alarm would sound and Lucius would wake. Pushing through the final line of heavy pines, Penelope burst onto the desolate 2-lane asphalt of the highway. Her lungs were burning, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She waved her arms frantically at the twin headlights piercing the fog. A battered, rusted pickup truck slammed on its brakes, skidding slightly on the black ice. "Please," Penelope gasped, pulling open the passenger door before the bewildered driver could even speak. "Please, I have cash. Just drive. Take me to the Amtrak station in Albany. Don't stop. Please." The driver, an older man in a faded flannel shirt, took one look at her terrified, tear-streaked face, her bleeding hands, and the expensive, ruined silk of her gown, and hit the gas. As the truck accelerated down the dark highway, Penelope looked in the side mirror. The imposing Gothic spires of Whitmore Manor were swallowed by the fog. She had escaped the devil, but as the adrenaline began to fade, a new freezing dread settled in her gut. The devil did not like to lose what belonged to him. When Lucius Carlyle awoke, the air in the master suite was wrong. He didn't need to open his eyes to know she was gone. For 6 months, he had awoken to the rhythmic, comforting sound of Penelope's heartbeat. He had grown addicted to the scent of her, a warm, intoxicating blend of vanilla old paper and the sweet, musky sweat that pooled in the soft creases of her thighs and beneath her heavy breasts. He loved burying his face in her plush stomach, listening to the life thrumming inside her. Now there was only the hollow, deafening silence of the stone walls. Lucius threw off the heavy velvet duvet, his movements a blur of unnatural speed. In a fraction of a second, he was standing by her side of the massive four-poster bed. The sheets were cold. The closet door was slightly ajar, revealing her heavy winter coat was missing. A low, guttural snarl built in the back of his throat, vibrating with such ancient, terrible power that the reinforced glass of the bedroom windows spiderwebbed with hairline fractures. He moved through the manor like a force of nature. The heavy oak doors of the West Wing study were thrown open, the wood splintering off the hinges. He saw the open drawer. He saw that Joanne's bloody locket had been moved. She knew. His brilliant, beautiful, soft human had figured it out. Within minutes, the entire estate was violently awake. The elite guards of the Night Syndicate vampires, who had survived centuries of warfare, stood trembling in the grand foyer as their king descended the marble staircase. Lucius was dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, but his eyes, usually a calm, terrifying slate gray, were glowing with a luminescent blood-red fury. He found Thomas cowering near the perimeter wall. Lucius didn't ask questions. He simply reached out his pale hand, plunging through the young vampire's chest, with the ease of a knife through water, ripping out his undead heart and crushing it into ash. "She has a 3-hour head start," Lucius addressed his inner circle, his voice a deadly quiet whisper that echoed ominously in the cavernous hall. "Tear up the roads, ground every private jet at Teterboro and JFK, bribe the port authorities. I want the northeastern grid locked down." "My lord," ventured one of his oldest lieutenants, a French vampire named Leon. "The High Council in Boston will view such a massive mobilization as an act of war. The human authorities will notice." Lucius moved so fast, Leon didn't even have time to blink before the king's hand was clamped around his throat, lifting the towering immortal off the floor. "Let the council view it however they wish," Lucius hissed, his fangs fully descended, dripping with venom. "If they hide her, I will burn their sanctuaries to the ground. If the humans interfere, I will slaughter them in the streets. Penelope is mine. Find her, or I will replace every one of you." 2 weeks later, the city of Providence, Rhode Island, was burning. Penelope sat in a dingy, fluorescent-lit diner on the outskirts of Baltimore, Maryland, staring at the muted television mounted above the pie case. She was wearing an oversized thrift store sweater that hid the luxurious curves Lucius had so adored, her dark hair chopped short and dyed a harsh box blonde. She had aged 5 years in 14 days. The physical toll of running, of sleeping on cheap motels, sagging mattresses, of eating stale bread to save the little cash she had was profound. Her body ached, her plush curves feeling heavier, weighed down by exhaustion and paranoia, but she was free. Or so she tried to tell herself. On the screen, the news ticker flashed in bright red letters. "Massive industrial fire destroys historic Providence. Warehouse district. Death toll climbing." The news anchor babbled about a catastrophic gas main failure, but Penelope knew better. The warehouse district in Providence was the headquarters of the New England Hunter Coalition, an underground human faction that occasionally offered safe passage to supernatural fugitives. Penelope had briefly considered going to them before realizing Lucius would anticipate it. She took a sip of her bitter, lukewarm coffee, her hands trembling violently. He was burning them out. He was systematically moving down the eastern seaboard, interrogating, torturing, and incinerating anyone who might have helped her. 3 days ago, it was a freak chemical explosion at a logistics center in Connecticut, a known front for a werewolf pack. Yesterday, it was a sudden violent riot in a New Jersey nightclub owned by a rival vampire clan. Lucius wasn't just searching for her. He was throwing a catastrophic, apocalyptic tantrum. He was punishing the world for letting her slip away. "Hey, Penny, I mean Patty," the weary diner manager, a heavy-set man named Carl, called out from behind the grill. "You okay? You look like you're about to pass out." I'm fine, Carl. Penelope lied, her voice raspy. She had adopted the name Patty and paid Carl under the table to let her wash dishes and serve the graveyard shift. It was grueling, unglamorous work, a far cry from her silk gowns and Michelin-starred meals, but the grease and the sweat made her feel brilliantly, wonderfully human. Suddenly, the diner's overhead lights flickered. The low hum of the ancient refrigerator behind the counter abruptly died. A sudden, unnatural chill swept through the room, dropping the temperature so rapidly that Penelope could see her own breath pluming in the air, just like that night in the woods. The little bell above the diner's glass door chimed. Penelope froze, her heart seizing in her chest. The smell hit her first, the undeniable metallic tang of old blood mixed with the sharp electric scent of ozone and burning ash. Slowly, agonizingly, she turned her head toward the entrance. A tall, impeccably dressed figure stood in the doorway, the collar of his expensive wool coat turned up against the Baltimore rain. The streetlights caught the sharp angles of his jaw and the terrifying, familiar red glow in his eyes. He had found her. The diner went dead silent, save for the frantic, sputtering buzz of the failing neon sign in the window. Lucius Carlyle did not burst through the door with the feral violence of a monster. He stepped over the threshold with the terrifying, predatory grace of royalty. His charcoal coat was pristine, entirely unbothered by the miserable Baltimore downpour. The harsh, unnatural fluorescent lighting of the diner should have made him look garish, but instead it only highlighted the immaculate, marble-like perfection of his features. Penelope's breath caught in her throat, a choked sob trapped behind her teeth. Her thick, trembling fingers gripped the edge of the formica counter so hard her knuckles turned a mottled, bruised purple. She felt the heavy, exhausted weight of her plush body betraying her, her legs turning to lead. There was nowhere to run. The back exit led to a fenced-in alley, a dead end she had noted on her very first shift. Patty, Carl, the diner manager, wiped his greasy hands on his apron, stepping out from behind the grill. He was a large man, fiercely protective of his graveyard shift employees, but he was entirely oblivious to the apex predator standing before him. "Hey, buddy, we're closed for maintenance. You're gonna have to find coffee down the street." Lucius didn't even look at the man. His luminescent slate-gray eyes were locked entirely on Penelope, devouring the sight of her. He took in her butchered, bleached hair, the dark, bruised circles under her eyes, and the baggy, atrocious thrift store sweater that hid the lush, magnificent curves he had spent 6 months worshipping. A muscle feathered in his tight jaw. "Do you have any idea?" Lucius whispered, his voice, a smooth, silken razor blade that effortlessly carried across the diner. "What you have done to me, Penelope? Leave her alone," Carl barked, stepping between them, reaching under the counter for the heavy steel flashlight he kept for unruly drunks. Before Penelope could scream a warning, Lucius moved. It was a blur of violence so fast the human eye couldn't track it. 1 second he was by the door, and the next he was standing directly in front of Carl. He seized the heavy-set man by the throat and hoisted him 2 feet into the air, pinning him against the stainless steel exhaust hood. Carl gagged his legs, kicking wildly, his face turning a terrifying shade of plum. "Lucius, no, stop!" Penelope shrieked, her voice tearing from her throat. She abandoned the safety of the counter, throwing her heavy weight forward, her hands desperately clawing at his iron-clad arm. "Please, he doesn't know anything, I'll go with you. Just put him down." Lucius turned his head slowly, his cold eyes dropping to where her soft, trembling hands gripped his sleeve. The murderous tension in his shoulders fractionally loosened. He dropped Carl, who collapsed to the floor in a wheezing, coughing heap, clutching his bruised neck. "You ran from me," Lucius stated, stepping into Penelope's personal space. The ambient temperature around him was freezing, a stark contrast to the sweat breaking out across her flushed, plump cheeks. He reached out his icy, gloved fingers, gently brushing the rough, dyed ends of her hair. "You tore my heart out of my chest, my beautiful, foolish queen. You fled into the freezing mud like a common thief. You murdered them!" She spat, hot tears finally spilling over her lashes, defiance warring with absolute terror. She refused to shrink away, forcing her plush chest to heave with deep, angry breaths. "You killed my landlord. You killed Joanne. You left her bloody locket in your desk like a trophy. You're a psychopath." Lucius's hand froze against her cheek. For a fraction of a second, genuine, unadulterated confusion flickered in his ancient eyes. Then his expression hardened into something infinitely darker and more complex. "Your landlord was a disgusting voyeur who installed hidden cameras in your bathroom, Penelope. I dealt with him because human law would have only given him a slap on the wrist," Lucius said softly, stepping closer until his chest brushed against her soft breasts. "But Joanne, I did not kill your precious friend." "Liar," she sobbed, shaking her head. "I saw her locket, covered in blood. Because it was forcibly removed from her neck by the people she sold you to? Lucius snarled, his voice vibrating with sudden explosive rage. Did you really think the Kensington Antiquities Trust hired a woman with no field experience just to archive old books? Did you think it was a coincidence they placed you in Boston, exactly where my syndicate operated? Penelope blinked, the room spinning. What are you talking about? Kensington is a front, Lucius hissed, his hands gripping her thick waist, grounding her to him. They are the Vanguard Directive, a fanatical order of human hunters funded by Vatican splinter cells. Joanne was your handler. She identified your bloodline, a dormant, incredibly rare genetic marker that acts as a potent narcotic to my kind. She sold you to the Vanguard, Penelope. They used you as bait. They wanted me to become obsessed with you. They wanted me distracted, so they could map my estate's defenses. No, Penelope whispered, stumbling back, her heavy thighs knocking against a booth. No, Joanne wouldn't. We've been friends since college. She accepted $3 million for your life, Lucius said ruthlessly, pulling a crumpled, blood-stained bank transfer slip from his coat pocket and tossing it onto the table. The name Joanne Miller was printed clearly next to an offshore account number. When they realized I was going to turn you, making you immortal and useless to them, they panicked. They moved Joanne to London, but my people intercepted her. The blood on that locket was hers, yes. Because I tortured her for hours to find out what they had planned for you. Penelope stared at the paper, her mind fracturing. The golden cage hadn't just been Lucius's doing. She had been led into it by the one person she trusted. Before the horrific reality could fully sink in, the diner's front windows exploded inward. A deafening barrage of gunfire shattered the quiet night. Shards of safety glass tore through the air. Lucius roared a sound of pure demonic fury and tackled Penelope to the floor. His massive body covered her plush frame entirely, acting as an impenetrable shield. Penelope screamed as she heard the wet, sickening thud of bullets tearing into Lucius's back, but these weren't normal bullets. The smell of burning flesh and searing chemicals instantly filled the air. Silver nitrate and UV phosphorus. Lucius grunted, his body convulsing in agony above her. Blood, thick and black, dripped from his lips onto her cheek. Through the shattered window, a dozen men dressed in black tactical gear poured into the diner, wielding heavy assault rifles and glowing ultraviolet floodlights. The Vanguard had found them, and they weren't here to rescue her. The diner was a chaotic storm of blinding white light and deafening gunfire. Lucius hoisted Penelope off the linoleum floor, with one arm ignoring the smoking craters burned into the expensive wool of his coat and the flesh beneath it. He moved with a brutal, desperate, limping speed, dragging her heavy, stumbling body toward the kitchen doors. Stay down, Lucius roared, throwing her bodily behind the thick stainless steel prep counter just as a barrage of high-caliber rounds tore through the swinging doors, shredding the industrial refrigerators. Penelope crashed to the floor, her heavy thighs bruising against the tile. She was hyperventilating, her plush chest heaving erratically. The world had inverted. The immortal monster who had kidnapped her was bleeding out on the greasy kitchen floor to protect her, while the so-called human authorities, the people her best friend had sold her to, were actively trying to turn them both into Swiss cheese. Lucius ripped a massive commercial gas cylinder from the wall, with his bare hands tearing the metal pipe like wet paper. He hurled it blindly over the counter toward the dining room. Close your eyes and cover your ears, he commanded, his voice tight with agonizing pain. Penelope slapped her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut. The explosion shook the very foundations of the building. A shockwave of heat and concussive force blasted over the counter, raining debris, pulverized plaster, and shattered plates down upon them. Screams echoed from the dining room as the front of the restaurant was consumed in a raging fireball. Through the thick, choking smoke, Lucius grabbed her hand. Run, now! They burst through the kitchen's rear fire exit, plunging into the freezing, rain-soaked Baltimore alley. Lucius didn't stop. He dragged her down a narrow service corridor, prying open a rusted iron grate that led down into the city's decommissioned subterranean storm drains. They descended into absolute darkness, the stench of stagnant water and rotting leaves overwhelming them. They walked for what felt like hours through the dripping, cavernous tunnels. Penelope's lungs burned her soft legs, trembling with exhaustion, but she couldn't complain. Beside her, the seemingly invincible Vampire King was falling apart. Lucius was leaning heavily against the damp brick walls, his breathing wet and ragged. The ultraviolet phosphorus rounds were still burning inside his back, actively preventing his supernatural healing factor from closing the wounds. Finally, Lucius collapsed. His long legs gave out, and he slid down the curved tunnel wall, hitting the muddy concrete floor with a heavy splash. Lucius! Penelope gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. The freezing water soaked instantly through her cheap denim jeans, plastering them to her thick calves. She reached out her hands, shaking, and gently touched his shoulder. He hissed in pain, his head falling back against the brick. The luminescent glow in his eyes was fading, replaced by a dull, cloudy gray. His skin, usually pale and perfect, was ashen and flaking at the edges of his jaw. "Leave me," he whispered, coughing up a spatter of black blood. "The phosphorus, it's spreading. In a few minutes, I will enter torpor, a deep sleep. They will find me." Penelope stared at him. She thought about the golden cage at the Whitmore estate. She thought about the terrifying possessiveness, the suffocating isolation. But then she thought about the bank transfer slip, Joanne, the vanguard, the people who had priced her life at $3 million and sent a death squad to clean up the mess. Lucius had kept her as a prisoner, yes, but he had worshipped her. He had genuinely believed he was protecting her from a world that only saw her as a biological commodity. "No," Penelope said, her voice shaking but suddenly resolute. "I am not leaving you down here." She pulled the oversized, thick wool sweater over her head, shivering violently as the freezing underground air hit her thin undershirt. She bundled the heavy fabric and pressed it firmly against the worst of the smoking chemical burns on his chest and shoulder. Lucius groaned, his cold hand reaching up to weakly grip her plush, soft waist. Even dying, his instinct was to pull her closer to seek the radiant, vibrant warmth of her heavy body. "You are too good for this world, my beautiful girl," he murmured, his eyes fluttering shut. "I should have burned them all sooner." Before Penelope could reply, a splash echoed down the tunnel. A lone figure stepped out of the shadows, holding a high-powered tactical flashlight and a wicked, serrated machete coated in a dull silver sheen. He was a tall, rugged man with a scar slicing through his left eyebrow. He wore the tactical insignia of the Vanguard Directive. "Well, well," the hunter sneered, his voice echoing off the damp walls. "Gideon Cross, Vanguard Elite. I gotta admit, I didn't think the great Lucius Carlyle would go down hiding in a sewer with his fat little blood bag." Penelope's blood ran cold. She shifted her body instinctively, shielding Lucius's prone form with her own wide hips and soft torso. "Back off," Penelope said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, unfamiliar octave. Gideon laughed, taking a slow step forward. "Or what sweetheart Joanne told us you were docile. A quiet, heavy-set bookworm who wouldn't know which end of a gun to hold. Be a good girl, step aside, and let me take his head. The director wants to run some tests on your bone marrow, but if you cooperate, we might give you a nice clean cell." Penelope looked down at Lucius. He was barely conscious, but his fingers weakly squeezed her hip, a silent plea for her to run. She looked at the blood staining her hands. She looked at the hunter, who viewed her as nothing more than a fleshy test tube. Her hand blindly searched the debris on the tunnel floor. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, jagged piece of rusted iron rebar broken off from the old sewer grating. It was thick, heavy, and viciously sharp at one end. "Joanne," Penelope whispered, her eyes locking onto Gideon with a terrifying blank emptiness, "didn't know me as well as she thought." Gideon lunged, raising the silver machete, but Penelope didn't cower. She used the powerful, heavy muscles of her thick thighs to propel herself upward from the mud. She didn't try to outmaneuver him. She used her sheer mass. She drove her shoulder hard into Gideon's chest, throwing him off balance. As the hunter stumbled back into the shallow water, Penelope brought the jagged iron rebar down, with every ounce of furious, terrified strength in her plush body. The iron plunged deep into the gap between Gideon's tactical vest and his collarbone, severing his artery. The hunter dropped the machete, his eyes wide with shock, choking on his own blood before collapsing face first into the muddy water. Penelope stood over him, her chest heaving, her soft, generous curves trembling violently. Hot blood splattered across her face. She dropped the iron bar. She wasn't just a captive anymore. She had crossed a line in the dark, and there was no going back. She turned back to Lucius, whose eyes were open, just a fraction, watching her with a terrifying, awestruck adoration. The king had found his queen, and she had teeth of her own. The echo of the iron rebar tearing through flesh faded into the dripping, suffocating silence of the Baltimore storm drains. Penelope stood frozen, her chest heaving violently, the adrenaline crashing through her veins like shattered glass. She looked down at her bloody hands, then at the lifeless body of Gideon Cross, floating face down in the murky, freezing water. She, a quiet, heavy-set archivist who had never so much as swatted a spider without feeling guilty, had just butchered a trained paramilitary hunter. A weak, agonizing cough broke her shock. Penelope dropped to her knees, her thick, denim-clad thighs splashing into the filthy water as she scrambled back to Lucius. The Vampire King was rapidly deteriorating. The ultraviolet phosphorus from the Vanguard's hollow point rounds was eating through his supernatural flesh, preventing his cells from regenerating. His pristine marble-like skin had turned a horrific chalky grey, the veins protruding black and poisoned against his jawline. "Lucius," Penelope gasped, her soft, plush hands cupping his freezing face. She ignored the mud and blood smearing his perfect features. "Lucius, stay with me. What do I do? How do I stop the burning?" His eyelids fluttered, the luminescent slate grey of his irises dimmed to a dying ember. "You cannot," he breathed, his voice a dry, rasping death rattle. "The phosphorus destroys the host. I am out of time, my queen. Leave me. Take his comms. Find the extraction point." "Shut up!" Penelope sobbed, fear and a newfound ferocious anger boiling in her gut. She remembered what he had told her in the diner just minutes before the ambush. "She identified your bloodline, a dormant, incredibly rare genetic marker that acts as a potent narcotic to my kind." "My blood? It's a narcotic. It has to be strong enough to heal you." Lucius's eyes snapped open, a flash of pure, terrified lucidity breaking through the haze of his agony. "No, Penelope, no. If I taste you now, in this state, I will not be able to stop. I am starving, and you are too potent. I will drain your beautiful warm body until there is nothing left. I would rather burn to ash." He tried to push her away, but his iron strength was entirely gone. Penelope's soft, plush body, which she had spent a lifetime feeling insecure about, became her greatest weapon. She swung a heavy thigh over his hips, straddling his waist, and using her generous weight to pin him to the wet concrete. She wasn't a fragile porcelain doll he could command. She was an unmovable force of nature. "You don't get to die to absolve your guilt," Penelope said fiercely, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her plump cheeks. She reached out and grabbed the silver machete Gideon had dropped. "You dragged me into this nightmare, Lucius Carlyle, and you are going to get me out of it." Before he could protest, Penelope pressed the serrated edge of the silver blade against her own forearm and sliced. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as the hot crimson blood welled up, spilling rapidly over her pale skin. The scent hit the stagnant air of the sewer like a nuclear shockwave. It didn't smell like regular human blood, metallic and coppery. It smelled intoxicatingly sweet, like crushed velvet, dark honey, an ancient, unearthly power. Lucius's body convulsed violently beneath her. A feral, guttural snarl ripped from his throat, his fangs fully descending. The monster inside him, starved and dying, reacted instantly to the intoxicating aroma. Penelope pressed her bleeding forearm directly against his parted, blood-stained lips. The moment his tongue tasted her blood, Lucius lost his mind. His hands, previously weak and dying, suddenly clamped onto her thick waist with the crushing force of a vice. He dragged her plush body down hard against his chest, his mouth latching onto her arm. He didn't just drink, he devoured. A wave of dizzying, euphoric heat crashed through Penelope's system. The bite didn't hurt. Instead, a potent supernatural endorphin rush flooded her brain, a biological mechanism designed to make the prey pliant. Her vision blurred, her heavy head falling back against the brick wall of the tunnel. She felt the incredible, terrifying suction of his mouth drawing the life from her veins. As he drank, the transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The black, poisoned veins on Lucius's neck rapidly receded, flushing with vibrant, immortal life. The smoking, charred flesh on his shoulder, where the phosphorus had eaten away muscle, began to knit together with horrifying, wet, snapping sounds. "He's taking too much," her fading, dizzy brain warned her. The cold of the sewer was creeping into her bones. She felt her plush chest growing heavy, her heartbeat slowing to a dangerously sluggish rhythm. "Lucius," she mumbled, her voice thick and slurred. She tried to push against his shoulders, but her arms were like lead. "Lucius, please." He didn't hear her. He was drowning in the ecstasy of her blood. It was the purest, most concentrated essence he had ever consumed in 800 years. Summoning the absolute last shred of her willpower, Penelope let her heavy body go completely limp, dead-weighting herself against his chest. A soft stomach pressed flush against his rigid abs, her thick thighs bracketing him intimately in the filthy water. "Lucius, I'm cold." That single fragile whisper shattered his frenzy. Lucius ripped his mouth away from her arm, gasping for air, as if he had been submerged underwater. His eyes, now blazing with a blinding, terrifying crimson light, darted wildly to her pale, plump face. He saw her eyes rolling back, her heavy limbs going slack. "No, no, no!" he chanted, horror contorting his perfect features. He bit into his own wrist, severing his vein with his fangs, and pressed his bleeding flesh against her parted lips. "Drink, my love, drink." Penelope weakly swallowed the thick, metallic, freezing blood of the vampire king. The effect was like a bolt of lightning striking her heart. Her eyes flew open, her pupils dilating as immortal power surged through her human veins, instantly replacing the volume she had lost. The bleeding on her arm stopped immediately, the wound sealing itself into a faint silver scar. Lucius pulled her up into his lap, burying his face in the crook of her neck, trembling violently. He was fully healed, vibrating with lethal power, but he held her soft, generous body as if she were made of spun glass. "You saved me," he whispered into her wet skin, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded terrifyingly close to tears. "You chose me." Penelope wrapped her arms around his broad, imposing shoulders, the reality of the blood pact settling into her bones. She wasn't his prisoner anymore. She was his equal, and they had a war to fight. An hour later, the torrential Baltimore rain washed the sewer muck off their clothes as they emerged from a forgotten maintenance hatch 2 blocks from the inner harbor. Lucius moved with terrifying renewed grace, keeping Penelope tucked securely under his arm. Her plush body felt exhausted, yet strangely hyper-aware, her senses dialed up to an unnatural degree, thanks to the few drops of his blood still singing in her system. They bypassed the heavily monitored streets and slipped through the loading docks of the Four Seasons Hotel in Harbor East. Aegis Financial, Lucius's vast corporate empire, quietly owned a controlling stake in the luxury property. Lucius bypassed the lobby, entirely tearing a reinforced steel door off a private VIP-only elevator shaft and overriding the biometrics with a thumb drive he pulled from his ruined coat. When the polished brass doors slid open onto the penthouse level, Penelope stepped into a world of sickening, untouchable wealth. The suite offered a panoramic floor-to-ceiling view of the dark harbor, but Penelope only had eyes for the massive marble bathroom. "Go," Lucius said softly, his red eyes tracking the exhausted slump of her heavy shoulders. "Wash the blood off. I need to secure the perimeter and access the Vanguard's network." Penelope didn't argue. She stripped off the filthy, oversized sweater and the heavy, sodden jeans, stepping into the massive, glass-enclosed shower. As the steaming hot water cascaded over her, she looked down at her body. She had spent a lifetime hiding her thick thighs, her plush, rounded stomach, and her heavy breasts under baggy clothes, feeling like she took up too much space in a world obsessed with thinness. But tonight, this very body had shielded a king. Her mass had taken down an elite hunter. Her rich, potent blood had brought a god back from the brink of ash. When she finally stepped out, wrapping her lush curves in a thick, luxurious white robe, she found Lucius standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had discarded his ruined suit and was wearing only a dark pair of tailored trousers, his heavily scarred, impossibly muscular torso bare to the ambient light of the city. On the glass coffee table sat the ruggedized Panasonic toughpad he had looted from Gideon's corpse. "They think we are dead," Lucius said without turning around. His voice was a calm, lethal baritone. "The diner explosion triggered a secondary gas main. The block is gone. The local authorities are attributing it to a domestic terror cell." Penelope walked over her bare feet, silent on the plush carpet. She sank into the heavy leather sofa, her body sinking into the cushions. "And the Vanguard?" Lucius finally turned to face her. His expression was cold, calculating, and utterly terrifying. He picked up the heavy Panasonic tablet and handed it to her. "Gideon's comms were heavily encrypted. I had to route the decryption through the main servers at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab to break it. I found his final extraction orders." Penelope looked at the glowing screen. It was a digital map of the East Coast, with a blinking red coordinates marker nestled deep in the rural, heavily forested mountains near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. But that wasn't what made her breath hitch. Below the map was a text log. "Director J. Miller, target is highly volatile. If Carlisle cannot be contained, terminate him. Bring the girl alive. Her tissue samples are critical to the Gettysburg Project." Penelope stared at the name, J. Miller. "Joanne!" she whispered, her voice cracking. The final, fragile illusion of her old life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "She isn't just a handler, she's the director. She faked her death to motivate my fury, knowing I would become reckless and track the scent to Boston." Lucius explained, his eyes darkening as he watched the betrayal ravage Penelope's face. "The Vanguard doesn't just want your blood to study, Penelope. The Gettysburg Project. It is a breeding facility. They have been hunting down the dormant carriers of your bloodline for decades. They want to weaponize your biology to create a super soldier serum capable of matching immortal strength. Bile rose in Penelope's throat. Her best friend, the woman she had shared apartments with, cried over breakups with, and trusted with her deepest insecurities. Joanne hadn't just sold her to a monster. Joanne was the monster. Joanne had looked at Penelope's soft, warm, trusting nature and seen only raw material to be harvested in a cage far worse than anything Lucius had ever built. "They have others," Penelope said, her hands trembling as she clutched the tablet to her plush chest. "Other people like me, locked up in that place." Lucius knelt before her, entirely ignoring his own dominance, to place himself at her feet. He reached out his cool, pale hands, resting gently on her thick robe-clad thighs, an anchor in the storm of her panic. "They do," Lucius confirmed softly. "And the Vanguard believes you died in the sewer tonight. They believe they have won." Penelope looked down at the vampire king kneeling before her. She saw the absolute terrifying devotion in his eyes. He had burned cities simply because he thought she was missing. What would he do if she asked him to destroy her enemies? "Lucius," Penelope said, her voice dropping the tremble, replaced by a cold, hard steel she didn't know she possessed. She leaned forward, her heavy breasts pressing against the soft fabric of the robe, her eyes locking onto his. "I want to burn it to the ground, all of it. I want Joanne to look me in the eye before she dies." A slow, wicked, and breathtakingly beautiful smile spread across Lucius's face, his fangs glinting in the city lights. He leaned up, pressing a deeply reverent bloody kiss to the soft curve of her plush waist. "As you command, my queen," he whispered into the terry cloth. "We leave for Gettysburg at midnight." The Michaud State Forest, stretching across the Appalachian Mountains near the historic Gettysburg battlefield, was suffocated by a freezing starless night. Hidden deep within the dense timberline sat the Buchanan Geological Survey outpost. On paper, it was a heavily funded federal research annex. In reality, it was the Vanguard Directive's beating heart, a sterile subterranean nightmare built to harvest human beings. Penelope stood at the edge of the tree line, her breath pluming in the icy air. She was no longer wearing a terrified girl's silk nightgown or a fugitive's thrift store rags. She was clad in black tactical gear, custom-tailored by Aegis Financial's underground quartermasters. A reinforced Kevlar vest securely hugged her heavy breasts and plush waist, while dark, durable cargo pants stretched comfortably over her thick thighs and wide hips. Resting heavy in her hands was a modified HK-MP5 submachine gun. She wasn't a trained soldier, but the lingering drops of Lucius's immortal blood in her system had sharpened her vision to a predatory degree and steadied her hands. Beside her, Lucius Carlyle was a monument of terrifying, beautiful destruction, flanked by his most lethal lieutenants, including the towering French immortal Leon the Vampire King, stared down at the concrete-reinforced bunker doors. "They have biometric locks, titanium plating, and a dozen snipers with thermal scopes on the ridge," Leon murmured, adjusting his rifle. "Blind the scopes," Lucius commanded softly, "and tear the doors off their hinges." The forest erupted. In a fraction of a second, the snipers on the ridge were silenced by blurs of unnatural movement. Lucius did not wait for the all-clear. He walked directly out into the open clearing. Two automated heavy machine gun turrets mounted on the bunker whirred to life, spitting a deafening barrage of armor-piercing rounds. Lucius moved with a speed that defied physics, dodging the ballistic hail. He reached the massive titanium blast doors, dug his pale, bare hands deep into the microscopic seam of the metal, and roared. With a screech of tearing metal that echoed for miles, Lucius ripped the 100-ton doors completely out of the concrete wall, tossing them aside like scrap paper. "Keep her behind me," Lucius ordered Leon, though his glowing crimson eyes flicked back to ensure Penelope was safe. They descended into the belly of the beast. The Vanguard facility was a sprawling labyrinth of blinding white tiles and sterile glass. It was meant to be an impenetrable fortress, but against an enraged, fully fed, ancient vampire, it was nothing but a tomb. The syndicate swept through the corridors like a tidal wave of blood and shadow, painting the pristine white walls a horrific, visceral crimson. Penelope followed closely behind her boots, splashing in the pooling blood. She felt a profound, disturbing calm. The soft, heavy-set archivist who used to apologize for taking up space on the subway was dead. They reached the lowest level, sub-level 4. Lucius kicked open the reinforced doors to the main laboratory, and Penelope's heart dropped into her stomach. It was a warehouse of human misery. Dozens of reinforced glass cells lined the walls. Inside, men and women were strapped to medical chairs, tubes siphoning their dark, potent blood into massive centrifuge vats. This was the Gettysburg Project. This was the exact fate Joanne had planned meant for her plush, vibrant body. "Stop!" A sharp, frantic voice echoed from the elevated control room. The bulletproof glass doors of the control room slid open, and Director Joanne Miller stepped out onto the catwalk. She wore a pristine white lab coat over a tailored suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. In her hands, she gripped a massive Desert Eagle handgun, loaded with silver nitrate rounds, aimed directly down at the lab floor. Joanne's eyes swept over the carnage, but when her gaze finally landed on the heavy-set woman standing boldly behind the Vampire King, the color completely drained from her face. "Penelope," Joanne gasped, her voice cracking in absolute disbelief. "You're supposed to be dead. Gideon is rotting in a Baltimore sewer," Penelope said, her voice projecting with a cold, ringing authority. She stepped out from behind Lucius's massive frame. She stood tall, letting the tactical gear emphasize every lush, generous curve of the body Joanne had tried to sell. "You always underestimated me, Joe. You don't understand what you're doing," Joanne screamed, her hands shaking. "He is a monster, Pen. Your bloodline is the key to human survival. You owe us this." "I owe you nothing," Penelope snarled. Her thick fingers tightened around the grip of her weapon. "You sat in my apartment, drank my wine, and smiled in my face while you calculated how many gallons you could drain from my veins. You aren't saving humanity. You're just a butcher in a lab coat." "If I can't have you alive, I'll take your corpse," Joanne shrieked, pulling the trigger. The deafening boom of the handgun echoed through the cavernous lab, but Lucius was already there. He caught the massive silver nitrate round squarely in his armored palm, dropping the crushed bullet to the floor, his crimson eyes locking onto Joanne with the promise of eternal suffering. "Tear her down," Lucius commanded. "No," Penelope interjected, raising her weapon. "She's mine." Joanne's eyes went wide with sheer terror. "Penelope, please, we were sisters." "You sold your sister for $3 million, Penelope said coldly. Without hesitation, Penelope pulled the trigger. A short, controlled burst of gunfire tore through the lab. Joanne was thrown backward violently, her white lab coat blooming with dark red flowers before she collapsed lifelessly onto the steel grating of the catwalk. The silence that followed was absolute. Penelope slowly lowered the weapon, her final tether to her old human life completely severed. She turned to look at the glass cells, at the terrified, exhausted prisoners staring back at her in awe. "Leon," Lucius said softly, stepping up to wrap his strong protective arm around Penelope's thick, plush waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Release the donors, burn the servers, erase this place from existence." As the syndicate systematically dismantled the laboratory, Lucius cupped Penelope's face. He looked at her, a full-figured, magnificent woman, dripping in sweat, gun, oil, and power, with absolute reverence. "You are magnificent," he whispered, pressing his lips to her soft, flushed cheek. Penelope leaned into his immortal coldness, a true queen standing in the heart of her kingdom. She had fled his golden cage, only to realize the real cage was the world that wanted her weak. Here in the ashes of the vanguard, she was infinite. "Take me home, Lucius," she murmured, and the king gladly obliged. The ashes of the Gettysburg Project settled, but the dark, bloody reign of the Vampire King and his plush, formidable queen has only just begun. From a terrified, soft-spoken captive to a ruthless leader who brought an ancient monster to his knees, Penelope's transformation proved that true power doesn't come in a fragile package. If you were captivated by this intense, twisting tale of betrayal, brutal vengeance, and dark, obsessive romance, make sure to smash that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a fierce, curvy heroine, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another heart-pounding supernatural drama.